My name's Tom Schuller, and I'm Chair of the Governors here at Working Men's College, and it's my pleasure to chair this evening's event. I want to say a couple of preliminary things. The first is to give an entirely unsolicited plug for a book called Rita and Gerald by Philip Stevens. Philip was a fireman, and then he got into adult education. I think he's gone through and done a PhD. There's a little bit of self-interest in that the Working Men's College gets a very, very good write-up in this. But I do actually just commend it as a good read that makes a really pretty inspiring case for adult education. He's talked to a range of students in different types of adult provision, lets them tell their stories, but also adds on others. So places like Ruskin, WEA, Mary Ward, and various other institutions are covered, and he does write extremely well, so I do commend that to you. The second thing is, I was at a meeting today where NIAS, that's the National Institute of Adult Continuing Education, launched their general election manifesto, and of course lots of warm things were said about adult education and lifelong learning. But I wanted to draw your attention, in case any of you are not aware of this, of just the latest position in respect of adult learning. Some of you may have seen that the announcement that there would be an 11% cut for the further education sector across the board, which is quite a large cut in any case. But the government has decided to ring-fence within that budget the money that goes to apprentices, because they believe in apprentices, as do I. But the implication of ring-fencing the money for apprentices is that the impact on what's called the adult skills budget is a 24% cut in 1 year. Well, I'm glad to hear at least a gasp, because this is a very severe situation. The letter giving the gory details has either arrived here today or will arrive tomorrow, and we'll have to spend some time working it out. And I'm confident the Working Men's College, we will come through this. We are very well placed. But I'm really speaking on behalf of the sector as a whole, where a 24% cut in a single year will have a very, very substantial impact. And one of the problems is that adult education, in spite of the warm words that anyone gives it, rarely achieves any major press coverage or media coverage. So if you compare the column inches that go into talking about universities and student fees, any of those, to the tiny, tucked away in a paragraph in a back corner somewhere if you're lucky, attention to further education and within that to adult education. So without striking too gloomy, well, it is a pretty gloomy note actually, I can't disguise that, but I just want to encourage those of you that use media, that write letters, that use social media, to get this message out. And if you are at forums, since we are leading up to a general election, I think there are some fairly severe questions that could be asked about the impact of those cuts. And can I just encourage you all to do as much as you can to make sure that other people know about this. So thank you, that's part of the deal, and if there isn't quite such lavish eats next time you come to a lecture, you'll understand the reason why. Anyway, on to the business of this evening. We have a change in the programme. Rebecca Cantor, who was going to speak as a solicitor specialising, has a pretty good excuse for not being here. She was in the High Court today, and she's in the Supreme Court tomorrow for some really pretty high-profile cases. So she can't be here, but with his characteristic resourcefulness, Satnam has, I'm not quite sure what the term would be, collared, or at any rate, recruited, I think would be the Ruth Hayes on my left here, who's director of the Islington Law Centre, not a solicitor but with a knowledge of the legal practices. And Ruth, we're really grateful to you for stepping in at about 5 minutes notice. So many thanks to that. Anyway, we're going to go across from my right to my left. Speakers will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. Okay on that? And then, as usual, we'll have plenty of time for questions and further comments. So I'm delighted that we've got really authoritative speakers here. In addition to Ruth, on my right is CAMPBELL ROBB, who's Chief Executive of Shelter. And on my left is James Murray, who's the Executive Member for Housing in Islington Council. So we really do have expertise. Cameron, could I ask you to...
Yep, I'm just going to be really... my name's Campbell, just for the record.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry, it's all right. I blame my parents. I usually get called Rob Campbell, so it's fine. It's a Scottish thing, but don't worry about it at all. It's a real pleasure to be here, and the sad story that we're talking about, further education cuts, really resonate with many of us, and I'm sure across the table as well. Many of us faced very significant cuts in legal aid. For example, during this Parliament, Shelter lost over £1 million worth of funding a year, which was helping us to help some of the most vulnerable people with their legal problems. These are huge cuts that many organisations face, and we all have a duty in civil society to support each other to do this. And so I support your campaign for higher and adult education. So I'm just going to say a little bit just about Shelter, just to give you a sense of why we're talking about this and what we do, and then try to give some national perspective on the housing crisis. And I'm going to spend more time on maybe some of the solutions than some of the problems, because the problems are well rehearsed and it's easy to talk about them, and it's actually harder and more interesting in a debate like this to talk about what some of the solutions might be. For those of you who don't know Shelter, last year we helped about 45,000 people face-to-face in giving them legal advice, support. We also had over 100,000 people phone up our website, our helpline, and we had over 4 million people visit our website for advice. So within reason, about 4.5 million people seeking some advice or support on housing issues, from the most vulnerable people literally being evicted and or street homeless to people just about to take a tenancy or a rented property and just getting some advice to do that. Every day, our frontline advisors are seeing the very, very real consequences of a housing crisis. And let's not pretend that anything else other than we are in the midst of a housing crisis. It is impacting on every part of our society here in London and across the country. Overcrowding, poor conditions, endemic instability and homelessness. These are the realities of most people's day-to-day lives, whether they are in the private rented sector, whether they're in social housing, and for many people now, even in their own mortgaged home. And that's why we campaign. That's why we believe that change is possible. That's why we take all that information and knowledge that we learn from the people that we help on a day-to-day basis, so that we can tackle the root cause. Because Shelter and many other charities and law centres across the country, we are but a band-aid for the problems and issues that we face as a society. We can help people on that day to get out, be kept in their home or not be evicted. But what we have to fundamentally recognise in our society is that we have a broken market, a broken housing system, and that needs to be fixed. Just to give you some sense of the scale of that, homelessness acceptances by London councils in the last 4 years have risen by over 500%. 250,000 London families now rent their homes privately. That's an increase of nearly 120%. Last year, in London and across the country, we saw very, very significant social change, where the first time since the early 60s, there are more people living in the private rented sector than there is in social rented accommodation. It's a very, very significant social and demographic change that we face. And all the while, ordinary Londoners and others are being priced out of the capital. Over a third of workers in London say they could not pay their rent or mortgage for more than a month if they lost their job. So we're not just talking about people who are in work, we're not just talking about people who are out of work. Across the spectrum, every day at Shelter, we see people facing all sorts of different and challenging issues relating to their housing. Many people in London paying between 40 and 50% of their disposable income on their accommodation, way above what is considered to be the norm, which is around about at the top end of the norm, which is around 30%. And so we are really, really in the midst of not just a housing crisis, but an affordability crisis. Why is that? I'm sure there'll be lots of different things. There are many variable reasons which would be quite interesting to talk about. At its fundamental and simplest is we have not built enough homes in this country for a couple of decades at least. Successive governments have failed to invest in housing and house building. The last great sort of surge of house buildings in the late 60s and early 70s has petered out over decades, and primarily that is the state that has stopped building. The private sector continues to build about 150 to 160,000 homes, which roughly, give or take, is what it's built every year since the end of the Second World War. When we see big bouts of house building in the last 50 years, that is when the state, either through local authorities or from the state itself, have invested in house building. And until we see that investment back into affording, that's why we don't have affordable homes built now, because the private sector does what it should do, what it's meant to do. It builds the houses it needs to build at the prices it wants to do, at the profit it wants to make. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that, that's what it does at the moment, and that's the way that it works, and until we have that investment back in. So it's very easy, as many of us probably facing it, to be daunted and to say this is too difficult, it's too big an issue to face, it's too costly, we should do nothing about it. I couldn't disagree with that more. If there is a time for us all to be rallying around and absolutely fighting to bring an end to this housing crisis, is now. And why is that? Because I think we are seeing a change in the issue. In London alone, it is now the single biggest issue for Londoners. Affordable housing is now, in polls recently that I've seen, is higher than transport and crime as an issue that most worries Londoners of all ages. That is also a top 5 national political issue, because many people, even those who have done well out of the housing market over the last few years, can see their own children not being able to afford a home or being priced out of the private rented sector. So for the first time across the spectrum, we're beginning to see a number of different age groups and a number of different people in different classes in different parts of society being impacted on the housing thing at the same time. So that political weight is something that many of us in Shelter and other charities and other places are trying to drive forward. I was lucky enough today to speak on a stage with Ken Loach. Many of you will know him as a great filmmaker, and one of the reasons I was talking with him is he is 50 years next year since Cathy Come Home was aired and Shelter was launched in its wake. But he was saying today that he thought that conditions were worse today than when he had made Cathy Come Home 50 years ago, just to give an indication of how serious and significant this is. But can we bring about change? Yes, we can. How do we do that? Shelter has outlined a plan, a 5-year plan for the next government and the next parliament, which could be building 250,000 extra homes across Britain by the end of the next parliament for an investment of £4.5 billion extra on what is already spent. That is only what was taken out of housing in the last spending review when housing was the biggest loser. We can do this. There are ways of doing it. We can do it with the land that we have available. We should probably use more land than is available. We can build on small bits of the green belt and still not have a great and glorious country that people want to see. Just to give you an example where I think that is, in Surrey, just to pick it at random, there is more land used for golf courses than there are for housing. So as a society, we have a choice. You can vote for more golf courses or you can vote for more housing. I leave it entirely up to you. I don't know what Islington Labour's view is on that, but I'm sure we might hear later on. So we can do that. We can fix the private rented sector. Just yesterday, Shelter and other organisations were able to get this Conservative government to put a measure in a deregulation bill, a regulatory measure which prevents landlords from doing what we call revenge evictions. At the moment, if you complain as a private renter about conditions in your property, you can be evicted immediately, almost immediately, as a result of that. So we can, and that's because we now have 11 million people living in the private rented sector in this country. That weight of pressure, that numbers of people, politicians are beginning to take notice. So we can fix the private rented sector, we can fix the building, and then the final thing is we have to fix the social centre. This country needs and should have genuinely, truly affordable homes, decent, available to everyone in this country. To do that, we need investment to make, whether we call it social housing, council housing, whatever your terminology is. The state needs to help us to build more homes that people can afford and keep and have decent and long-term tenancies that gives them the security to do that. This is all possible. Don't let anyone tell you it's not fixable. This is a problem that can be done. It's very depressing at the moment, but we believe passionately we can do something about it. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for your time.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Campbell. Thanks, that's great. We'll go straight on now to James to give us a local account against that national background. James.
Great. Thank you very much. And fortunately, I don't have to start by setting out our policy on golf courses in Islington, because we don't have any in Islington, I don't think. I know my borough pretty well, and I'm pretty sure we don't have that particular challenge. It does remind me of me getting lobbied about signing up to a campaign to ban fracking in Islington, which again is very easy to do because it is not something which really affects us much in Islington in a direct sense. But what does affect us in a very direct sense in Islington is the housing crisis. And I was going to give a few stats, but firstly I just want to give you an example of two blocks in Islington which I think are a really kind of stark example of quite how bad it's got. There's one block on Holloway Road. It's above the McDonald's on Holloway Road, at the corner of Jackson Road. And it's a building that used to be a hostel. And in this hostel there were 19 rooms, all of which were the right size. It's basically just for an individual bed and not much else. There was then a landlord, quite a well-known, famous or infamous landlord, who bought this block. And he tried to convert each of the individual rooms in this hostel into what he termed a self-contained studio flat. And that meant putting in there a shower cubicle, a sink, a cupboard, a kitchenette, and of course a bed which was there already. And this meant these rooms were so small that there was one woman that we saw the details of who explained how she had to move her bed out of the way to get in the shower and then push it back to get out of the door. You know, that's the kind of space standards we were talking about, and yet these flats, these so-called flats, were being rented out for £255 a week, which was the maximum allowable under the housing benefit cap. So that's one building up on Holloway Road. If you then go a mile or so down the borough to City Road, just the other end of Islington, you've then got a building which is being built there at the moment called, and it's a very swish name, the Canaletto Tower. It's going to be a 24-storey tower. It's about, I guess, 20 stories there already. But I actually found this about over 2 years ago in December 2012. It was over the Christmas break, and I was doing a bit of housing research, as you do on your Christmas break. And I found this property, this building, the flats in this building being advertised already, even though they hadn't even broken ground. It was just a flat concrete site at that time. They'd been advertised on the website of Knight Frank Hong Kong as an investment property. You know, and we know from our own research that we've done in Islington that up to a quarter of new flats and new developments appear to remain there empty and get sold, with one in this Canaletto Tower at the moment, a one-bed flat for £900,000. So I think these two buildings could really illustrate quite how dysfunctional it's got in Islington. These two buildings, I think, do that very graphically. And across London, I mean, I won't go into all the stats because we've heard already from Campbell some of the extent of the housing crisis, but just to give you three numbers which I think really sum up the housing crisis in London. Firstly, the number of renters, which has gone from about 15% to over 30% in 10 years. Those renters are now paying an average of £280 a week to rent. The average home to buy costs £500,000, and at the same time around 10,000 socially rented homes a year are being re-let at higher rents nearer market level. So they're effectively draining out of the social rented system as we know it. And if you think of that combination of the rents going up and more people renting, homes being unaffordable to buy, and social rents starting to track market rents to a much greater extent, you can see how this system is breaking down. And actually, not just the economic vitality of London, but also the essence of what makes us the world's greatest city, to be honest, is beginning to slip through our fingers. Now, to take, again, Campbell's advice, not to focus too much on the problems and talk about the solutions. That's what I'll try and do when I speak as well. But I think it is worth just pointing out how we got here, you know, because it's not just by chance. And I think it's worth pointing out the forces which are at play here, and in particular the political decisions which have been taken along the way, which have left us in the situation where we are now, because this is not something which is inevitable, and it's not something which happens in a vacuum. I mean, what we're seeing in a way at the moment, expressed at its most simple, is the unavoidable failures of an unrestrained, unregulated market when it comes to housing, because we've had a government and a mayor for the current terms of both those institutions who are very much of the view that you should just let the market rip, and somehow that will sort out the housing crisis. And as we know, again, as Campbell said, if you do simply let the private market try and build homes we need, we never get anywhere near the number of homes that we actually need in this country. It's only been when we've had public building that we've got anywhere near there. Although the T word was not mentioned earlier, this did happen under Thatcher. If you look at the numbers, in the late 1970s, councils were building 150,000 homes a year, and when Thatcher left office, they were about 1,500. You know, so go down by a vast factor of decline. I mean, that's where the bottom has really been pulled out of home building in this country. And as I said, yet despite all of that, we now have a government and a mayor who have this approach, which is just to let the market rip. So they essentially believe, and I've challenged them on this, they essentially believe that if you have crippling private rents, that's purely a market signal for landowners to develop land. You know, these are the people who have slashed the investment in affordable housing and let rents rise to take the strain, or rents, and in a lot of cases, benefits. And they are the people who've spent the last few years systematically dismantling the planning system, which has been allowing us to gain some affordable housing in London. And if I just focus on that a little bit, because I think this is a bit which can get a bit techie, but is so vital to what's going on in London. And I'll just talk very briefly about what's happened to the planning system over the last few years. The history of this is, I think, quite interesting and quite often missed out in conversations about this, because we talk about developers being forced to build affordable housing when they're having new developments. And if you look back to where this came from, when I first discovered this, it surprised me in that it was introduced by John Major's government to require affordable housing as part of planning developments. Why? Because they were getting some pressure about affordable housing, but they didn't want a state building programme. They didn't want to put any money into it, so they said, well, let's just put it into planning and make it some kind of planning condition. To a good extent, when they'd opened that door a bit, the Labour government, which then came in, strengthened those requirements. And then when Ken Livingstone became Mayor of London, he really went to a very bold extent and said, right, 50% of all new homes built in the city have to be affordable, which was a way of capturing all of that value in London's housing and putting it to a good end, rather than simply developers' profits or inflating land values. And so we had a situation in what seems now quite halcyon days in the mid-2000s, you know, where there was a firm line with developers, which developers knew, which impacted to an extent land values, and which delivered affordable housing. Then along came Boris Johnson. Then along came the coalition government. And Boris Johnson scrapped the 50% affordable housing target straight away. The government, as I've mentioned earlier, raised rents to a near market level. And in 2012, the whole planning system got turned on its head by the introduction of a very slippery concept called viability, which is essentially saying to developers, you make the argument to us why you can't afford any affordable housing. And one of the arguments for that is both your profit margin and the amount of money which you pay to the landowner. Now I realise this is all getting into quite a lot of techiness, so I'll just give you one example which hopefully brings it alive. Mount Pleasant, the Royal Mail site down in Clerkenwell, which is actually on the Islington-Camden border. There was a planning application which was put in to redevelop the car park of Mount Pleasant with about 700 homes. And this was an example of the planning system as it exists being exploited to its fullest extent, whereby the amount of affordable housing, despite our council saying 50% was achievable, the Royal Mail put in a planning application for 12% affordable housing. And by the time the application finally got to a decision stage, rents could have been up to £2,800 a month in an affordable rented flat. So that's the kind of warping of the definition of affordable which we've been talking about so far. And the crucial point that I was making just a moment ago about this viability really undermining the system was that Royal Mail claimed that because they had to pay such a huge amount for the land, they then could only afford a small amount of affordable housing. Royal Mail owned the land, and they were putting in the planning application, right? So Royal Mail, as planning applicant, was saying we have to pay Royal Mail, the landowner, so much for this land, we can't afford enough affordable housing. It really is that bizarre what happened there. But within the system of viability, that's what you can get away with, because land prices and viability is put primary rather than investing all of the extra value into affordable housing. So I'm going to stop with the doom and gloom. I'm going to talk about some of the positive things that I think we can do about this. And I'll start by talking a bit from a council perspective, what we can do under the current situation, even without any changes nationally or regionally. Firstly, we have to practice what we preach, and we have to show that we can build housing. And that's what I know we're doing in Islington, I know Camden are doing it, and there are lots of other authorities in London which are showing, even within the current borrowing constraints, you can build housing. When you own the land as a council, you can get homes built, and you can do this without selling off the land to private developers and thereby enabling them to take profit, and you can put the value of the land that we have in inner London into building affordable housing. And I think that in terms of us making a case nationally for that, I think councils proving it can be done is a really vital first step. If I take one example of a development which is going to planning next week, it's not without its critics, but it's going to build 140 homes on the King Square estate, which is down in just near Old Street and City Road. And out of those 140 homes, because some of them will be private, there's going to be about 42 private homes to fund the 98 affordable homes. So the maths of it can work out, and that includes, by the way, a lump sum for a nearby school as well. So the maths of it means that we can prioritise affordable housing over a land receipt, which might in another situation just be lost from the system. The other thing we can do is do some regulation of the private rented sector. I mean, the private rented sector in London is the worst in the whole country, and it really is, it's kind of Wild West in a lot of situations out there. And so one of the schemes that councils can do is introduce licensing of landlords. And licensing sounds like a technocratic solution, but what it really means is that if you live in a landlord licensing zone, councils can say to landlords there, you have to sign up to a certain set of standards. You have to have space standards. You have to make sure your properties are safe. You have to treat your tenants fairly. The basic stuff which really shouldn't be radical. I mean, it's kind of amazing that this is even talked as being something bold to do. But that's the kind of action which councils can take. And we've just approved a scheme last week, actually, in Islington, along Holloway Road and Caledonian Road, which covers about 3,500 tenants in some of the worst private rented accommodation in the borough. And the great thing about even the powers which exist already is that if landlords don't come forward to get a licence, you can fine them £20,000, they're liable to repay 12 months' rent, and all this is even there within the very weak legislation that we have at the moment. And I think councils are waking up to this, and again proving that they can play an active role, and hopefully make the case for future government that we can do even more. And finally, in terms of what councils can do now, I think there's a big role in planning. As I've gone through in some detail with my example before, there is all this value in London. We keep getting told about this booming housing market and about how much money there is to be made there. If we are the planning authority, we can ensure that that extra value, or at least a good proportion of it, goes back into the community. We can ensure that by giving that planning permission, that value goes back into affordable housing, back into infrastructure, rather than, as the present system does, lets it drift out into private hands. And that's something which we can do as well as councils at the moment. But to end on a slightly different note, there is only so much local authorities can do. Our hands are tied with borrowing caps, with restrictions on landlord licensing, with being overruled by other planning authorities, and we do need a government nationally. I would argue predictably, but very half-heartedly. We need a government who is serious about affordability, and I think the key thing to recognise here is a government of whatever political shade or combinations thereof we might have after May the 7th has to realise that there's no getting away from investing in affordable housing. And the ridiculous thing is, at the moment, we're spending a huge amount of money on housing every year. It's just being spent on housing benefit rather than building homes. So by 2017, the housing benefit bill is likely to have risen to £25 billion a year. Yet at the same time, only £1 billion is being put into building affordable housing. So there is money there being spent on housing. It's just going into housing benefit rather than into building homes. So never mind about mending the roof, as politicians quite often say, just build some roofs to start with, and then we'll be in a much better position. I think in London in particular, we need to make the private rented sector fit for purpose. We know that a lot of people don't want to stay in the private rented sector for the long term, but a lot of people are being forced to. And even if we can move away from that in the long run, the long run may be a long way away. And at the moment, for the first time in 50 years, more people in the country rent privately than rent socially. So we need to do something about people who are stuck there for the long term, particularly with families who need limits on their rents, and security of tenure. We need to make the planning system fit for purpose, as I think I've made quite clear in what I've said earlier. But I think I want to end on the point that although the general election is important, let's not ignore the mayoral election the year after, because the mayor has money. The mayor controls the affordable housing budget for London, and so what he or she says the money should be spent in has a big impact on what sort of homes we get built. And there is £400 million of housing budget there now, which is unallocated, which should be being invested in affordable housing. We also need to make sure that the mayor uses his or her planning powers to say to developers again they have to put money back into the system. But most of all, I think the argument I would end on is that the mayor should be a lead for this in London. The mayor and the advisors to the mayor are very clear about how many homes we need, that we need at least 50,000 homes to meet current need, if not a lot more in London, and yet fewer than half of those are being built. The mayor should be taking the lead in getting these homes built in London, and the mayor should be arguing for the other changes we need about regulating private rents, about taking on lettings agencies, about supporting homeless households, and so on. And we need to do that because we need politicians to step up. And to end where I started, we need politicians to step up and say, this doesn't have to be inevitable. We can do something about it.
Brilliant. Great, thank you very much, James. That's a lot to take in there. Right, Ruth, well, that's given you plenty of time to... anyway, just some remarks, if you can, from your end.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm sorry that Rebecca isn't here. She's done some very interesting cases. But I'll try and pick up a bit from the perspective, really, of people who are experiencing problems with their housing. So I work at Islington Law Centre. I know there are a number of other, Camden has its own law centre across London. Much of the work that is done is not dissimilar to the work that has been done by agencies like Shelter. There are specialist advisors to help low-income households. In 2013, the government introduced an act which is known as LASBO, which took out of scope whole areas of law from the scope of the legal aid system. And legal aid had been really there to try and ensure some sort of equality of arms for people. The scope changes meant that most debt work was no longer in scope, most welfare benefits work was no longer in scope. Housing was only in scope where the home was immediately at risk or there was severe disrepair. Immigration law was out of scope. A lot of family law was out of scope. Most employment law is out of scope. So really quite a fundamental shift for people. And the reason I mention the other areas is that often people hit a problem with their housing because something else has changed in their life. So they had a job, but then they lose a job. They had a partner, but their partner leaves, or they're bereaved. They have to move for domestic violence reasons, something else changes. So actually not being able to resolve some of those other issues can leave people at real risk of losing their home. At the same time as taking a whole lot of areas of law out of scope, the way in which contracts were allocated was changed. And although that sounds quite technical, what it really means is some good legal aid firms and some advice agencies that had quite big contracts, for example, my own agency had a contract to help 450 people a year. We had that reduced right down to 100 people a year. So suddenly we had to lose capacity to do that work, as did other agencies that were already working with people. And the net result of that is that it's now so difficult to get a housing solicitor that people are travelling miles, there are long waiting lists, people appear in court and having tried to seek help without having been able to get anyone to take their case on, even where they're technically eligible for legal aid. So it's a bit like the system used to be with NHS dentists. You can have a theoretical entitlement, but no one is obliged to take your case on. And these are people who often have tried quite hard to get assistance. So for people who don't have a phone that works, don't have any credit on their phone, don't speak English as first language, find it difficult to express themselves succinctly, it's almost impossible now in a whole lot of areas.
Are you of incidental health?
Pardon?
Mental health.
Yes, a lot of people with mental health problems are finding it especially difficult to get support. And we run the duty desk scheme at the local county court, which we do in conjunction with some private practice firms and with Shelter and with other agencies. And we're seeing people now who come, they've tried to get help, they can't get help, their case is adjourned to allow them time to try and get help, and they're back next week unable to have got any assistance in progressing their case. That's a real tragedy for the individual. It's actually not saving the public purse because there's a real cost to appearing repeatedly in court. In the worst case scenario, people are actually losing their homes because they couldn't get legal advice. And that's got a huge human cost. The life expectancy for single homeless men, I think, or Campbell probably knows it, 47.
Something like that,
It's incredibly young, and people are very likely to have both physical and mental health issues if they're forced out onto the street. We're also seeing a rise in sort of informal overcrowding, where people are sofa surfing, they're staying with friends, they're unable really to engage, if they're young people, with education, it's hard to sustain a job, it's hard to maintain any social networks because you have to keep moving on, because most people in London who aren't very rich don't have spare rooms. So you're sleeping literally in their sitting room, and that puts a real huge strain on households. And this has happened not in a vacuum. The other speakers have already mentioned welfare reform, and people will have seen in the press things like the bedroom tax, for example, which were billed as being about trying to tackle the housing crisis. So the suggestion was that there were lots of people who were living in premises that had spare rooms, and if they could be, persuaded to move into smaller properties, that would free up the larger properties for families. And that sounds quite fair. The reality is that often people's living situations are more complicated than that scenario suggests. Pensioners were in any event exempt. Well,
you're forced into debt.
Yes.
And then you'll be homeless, and you're looking.
You want to just hang on until we got questions coming up? Okay.
It's very. I mean, it was presented as if it gave tenants choice, and clearly, in reality, it has led to an enormous amount of human misery, and just impossible situations for people. It's not only people who are out of work, a whole range of other changes to the benefits system have come in at the same time that real wages in London are falling and that the cost of housing is going up and up and up. So 9 out of 10 new benefit claimants for housing benefit are in work. So the suggestion that somehow this, the solutions lie in the hands of individuals is clearly not the case, and it's clearly putting an enormous strain on people. There's also a real lack of secure tenancies, and one of the things that is really evident now is that whereas before, where a lot of people would be eligible for social housing with some security of tenure, even if you were able to pay your rent, you often only have 6 months tenure, and your landlord is perfectly entitled at the end of that, providing they do it procedurally correctly, to require the property back. That's leading to enormous difficulties for people, again, in sustaining work, in sustaining training, in sustaining their social networks. And there's new legislation coming in, which we have real concerns will make it even harder for people. So the Immigration Act will require, and is being rolled out in parts of the country, not in London at the moment, is requiring private sector landlords to check the immigration status of tenants before granting a tenancy. And again, that's presented as if it's to stop the sort of beds in sheds exploitation of migrant workers. In reality, a large number of people are simply unable to prove their immigration status. Most of us don't have, we're not in a country that has an ID card system. You can often prove that you've been in the UK for a long time. You can't prove your status for that. And we've had some very difficult cases already, particularly with older migrants from the Caribbean who came over 20, 30 years ago. who lost their original passport. They haven't needed it. They've been working, they've been paying their tax, they've been paying their national insurance, they've got a tenancy. Something changes, their employer changes, they're asked to provide evidence of their right to work in the UK, and they can no longer demonstrate that that's the case. And so we recently had a case of a man, he's a grandfather here, his whole life is in the UK, and his employer changed, so he lost his job because he couldn't prove it. He then couldn't claim benefits because he couldn't prove his status and was reliant on support from the food bank. And actually, after some detective work, we were able to help show that he does have the right to be in the UK, he's here legitimately, and his benefits have been restored. But there's no longer legal aid for immigration. So unless you've got some public, some local authority funded service, you suddenly find that you're out of the loop altogether. And I think what's worrying about this, and both other speakers have already mentioned it, it's not only the enormous stress for individuals, but it's allowing poor quality landlords to get away with absolutely shocking practice. And we're seeing this in employment, because actually you can't get legal aid to get employment advice anymore, and also there's very high employment tribunal fees. And what we're seeing is a rise in very poor practice amongst bad employers. And just the circumstances people are living in. I was at an open day where I was talking to some people, and a couple came up to speak to me, and they're sharing one room with their daughter. And their little girl was about to start school. The school had sent somebody round to do a sort of get to know you talk. And had commented that the accommodation is quite unsuitable. They're all in one room, they're sharing the kitchen with a couple of other families who've got a room each, and they share the bathroom with a couple of other families who share one room each. And we were saying, have you got a tenancy? And they were saying, well, no, but we pay every week. And their real fear was that their daughter would be taken away because they were unable to provide suitable housing. And that's really frightening experience. So instead of this being a good start to their daughter's education, and they were saying, but we're paying all we can afford. The mum was working, earning £200 a week. They were paying £100 a week, which is relatively cheap. And that was all they could afford. And actually they had no idea they might be entitled to any other support. But also what they knew was it was very unlikely they would get a social tenancy. And I was at a meeting at the weekend outside of Islington, but the sort of shift in practice away from investing in social housing and the rise of the demolition of some estates without offering people alternative accommodation, and a woman who'd been moved, and she'd asked for a bit more time because she wasn't well, and her son came back from school to find his flat boarded up with a neighbour there with the address of where they'd been put. She'd been in temporary accommodation for 16 years and moved on again. And I just think those real human stories about how the lack of investment in proper housing and the lack of access to adequate advice and help for people at difficult points in their life has created a real crisis. But like the other speakers, I think there are solutions. A lot of these things actually are not that difficult to do. And I think it is really critical that housing is seen as both a local election issue and a national government election issue. The issue of, I think the use of language has been very confusing for a lot of people. So I think the confusion about what's affordable rent, with your example of it being over £2,000 a month, which in most people's minds is nowhere near affordable. So the need to have clear language about social rent being genuinely affordable for people in average incomes. The need for lifelong tenancies, or at least longer security of tenure for private sector tenants, so that people have an opportunity to really build a life as part of a community, to take part in local activities, to be able to plan their life. And I would add also access to independent advice, because even in the best circumstances, sometimes things go wrong for people, and it's really important that they are able to try and secure and retain their home, because it's so critical to the quality of life.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Ruth.